It was a crisp autumn afternoon in London, the streets just beginning to hum with the evening buzz. Michael Wills, a polished businessman in his 40s, found himself lingering outside his son Jack's school longer than usual. With his slicked-back hair and tailored suits, Michael exuded an effortless charm that had long captivated his wife, Rachel. But today his thoughts were preoccupied with something, or rather, someone else, Clara Evans. Clara, Jack's English teacher, was in her early 30s with an undeniable allure. A few years ago, she had lost her husband to a tragic accident, and ever since her life had been marked by lonely evenings and empty weekends. She had no children and few friends, and found herself yearning for companionship, craving a sense of intimacy she hadn't felt in years. When she first met Michael during a parent-teacher conference, she had immediately sensed something in him, a vulnerability that he, perhaps unknowingly, wore on his sleeve, and she knew exactly how to use it. After that first meeting, Clara began making efforts to keep in contact with Michael, using Jack's academic progress as her excuse. Calls turned into frequent meetings, her outfits becoming progressively more revealing with each encounter. She noticed how his eyes lingered a little too long, how he seemed flustered by her proximity. He'd lean in a little closer, almost as if caught in a trance. And with each small, calculated gesture, Clara felt a thrill, something intoxicating, something that made her feel desired again. One evening, Clara called Michael under the guise of discussing Jack's slipping grades and invited him to her house. When Michael arrived, he found the front door ajar, and before he could knock, Clara appeared in nothing but a towel, claiming she'd just finished a shower and hadn't expected him so early. She motioned for him to wait, her face flushed in a way that seemed all too deliberate as she disappeared down the hallway toward the bathroom, leaving the door partially open. As he sat on her couch, he found himself unable to resist the temptation. Finally, he got up, moved toward the bathroom, and, catching a glimpse of her in the steamy light, saw her completely exposed. From that moment, a new chapter began between them. Their encounters grew more frequent, each one more intimate and daring than the last. She continued to play her role of the attentive teacher, albeit one who was quite clearly pushing boundaries, and Michael found himself unable to resist. They would meet at her house during school hours, sometimes even during the weekends when he told Rachel he had business meetings. Michael, however, was careful not to neglect his wife. He continued to shower her with affection, attempting to keep his two worlds separate. He was meticulous, making sure Rachel never had a reason to suspect his betrayal. And Rachel, immersed in her life, didn't notice at first. But as time went on, subtle changes began creeping in. Michael was slightly distracted at home, his phone more often in his pocket or flipped over on the table. The spontaneous, unexplained trips, and his sudden preoccupation with Jack's schooling, a subject he had previously left mostly to Rachel, became impossible to ignore. One evening, as Michael was in the shower, his phone buzzed with a message. Rachel glanced at it, noting the name on the screen, Clara. Though it seemed innocent enough, a small doubt crept into her mind, a whisper of something amiss. She brushed it off, but that night, she couldn't sleep. The thought of her husband with another woman. No, not just any woman, but a woman who had direct contact with her family, with her son, gnawed at her. Over the next few days, Rachel's suspicion grew. She began observing Michael closely, noticing small gestures, the way his face sometimes lit up at a text message, his subtle habit of slipping away to take calls in private. A quiet rage began to stir within her, but she knew she needed proof. And so, Rachel found herself doing something she never imagined she would. She started following him. After a few weeks, her fears were confirmed. She saw him entering Clara's apartment on a Sunday morning, watching as he disappeared through the door without so much as a backward glance. It felt like her world was collapsing around her, her chest tightening with each passing second. She waited, hours slipping by in agonizing silence, until he finally emerged, looking disheveled yet oddly content. That night, she confronted him. Michael tried to deny it at first, stammering over his words, but the look on Rachel's face made it clear that she wasn't going to be swayed. Finally, he admitted to the affair, trying to justify it as a mistake, a brief lapse in judgment. But Rachel's mind was already made up. She wasn't willing to let go of what she saw as her life, her marriage, and the stability of her family, all because of some lonely woman seeking to fill the void in her life. Over the following days, Rachel's despair turned into anger. She was unable to shake the image of Clara seducing her husband, using her allure to shatter her family. Rachel's mind began spiraling, obsessing over the idea of confronting Clara, to put an end to this once and for all. She pictured herself demanding answers, forcing Clara to face the consequences of her actions. In her mind, it was Clara who had seduced Michael, Clara who had used her body and her charm to lure him away from his family. One evening, as she sat in the dimly lit kitchen, her thoughts grew darker. What if she could put an end to this herself? What if she could remove Clara from the picture entirely? The thought took root in her mind, growing more tempting with each passing day, until it became an obsession. She began following Clara, watching her routine, memorizing the little details. When she left for school, when she returned, her preferred coffee shops, even the way she carried herself with that quiet confidence Rachel found so infuriating. Rachel's opportunity came on a Friday evening. Clara had asked Michael to come by, and Rachel, sensing her chance, insisted on coming along. Michael argued, uncomfortable with the idea of the two women meeting, but Rachel was insistent. Clara wouldn't suspect a thing. They arrived together, Rachel's heart pounding with barely contained fury, while Michael felt the tension in the air and knew there was no turning back. As they entered Clara's apartment, Clara appeared in a slinky, low-cut dress, her face lighting up in surprise and slight embarrassment upon seeing Rachel. It was as if the walls were closing in on her. She greeted Rachel with a strained smile, clearly unsettled, but Rachel was cold, her words curt and precise. The conversation quickly grew heated. Rachel accused Clara of intentionally destroying her family, of using her seductive charm to ruin her marriage. Clara tried to defend herself, but Rachel wasn't listening, each word fueling her rage, stoking the fire that had been building for weeks. Michael, caught between the two women, attempted to diffuse the tension, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. As the confrontation escalated, Clara's confidence wavered. The defiant spark in her eyes dimmed as she realized the extent of Rachel's fury. She backed away, her voice trembling as she tried to explain herself, but Rachel only saw the woman who had stolen her husband, who had intruded into her life and shattered her happiness. Then Rachel took a step closer, her face a mask of cold, calculating rage. Clara, now genuinely afraid, looked to Michael, but he stood frozen, unable to act. And in that charged moment, Rachel made her decision, a decision that would irrevocably change all their lives. Clara's tone sharpened, a twisted confidence glinting in her eyes. She believed Rachel couldn't touch her. After all, it was Michael who had sought her out. "Your husband came to me, Rachel," Clara taunted, a smirk curling her lips. "We shared everything, pleasures you clearly weren't giving him. If you want someone to blame, don't just look at me." Rachel's hands clenched at her sides, her voice trembling with restrained fury. "You seduced him, Clara, parading around, pretending to be his innocent son's teacher when you knew exactly what you were doing." Clara held her ground, even daring to step closer, defiance burning in her eyes. "I'll dress how I want. You don't get to tell me what I do with my own body, Rachel." With a wild defiance, Clara slipped out of her dress, baring herself completely naked. She lowered herself into a chair, sitting brazenly before Michael, her legs parted in a deliberate display of her private parts. "I'll seduce him as I please," she said, her voice barely a whisper but heavy with mockery. "Even now, if I want to, and now your husband is gonna come to lick it, and all this in front of you." Michael, caught in the unbearable tension, shut his eyes, hoping to erase the scene from his mind, realizing that any reaction could seal his fate. But Rachel was beyond reason. Her rage had reached a fever pitch. Without hesitation, she seized a fork from the table, her grip tight and unyielding. Before Clara could react, Rachel drove it deep into her throat. Overcome by a blind, consuming wrath, she plunged the fork repeatedly, her strikes growing more fervent with each blow. Clara's screams faded into gurgled cries as blood pooled around her, her life slipping away. Rachel stood over her, her chest heaving, her fury now mingled with shock as Clara's gaze turned glassy, frozen in silent terror. The silence in Clara's apartment was oppressive. Clara lay motionless on the floor, her face a pale contrast to the deep red pooling beneath her. Michael, standing in shock, could only stare at the scene, the grim reality sinking in. The woman he had been entangled with for months was now lifeless, a consequence he could never have foreseen. Rachel took a step back, her breath shallow. The magnitude of her actions hit her, and for a moment she thought she might faint. She had wanted to confront Clara, to make her understand the destruction she had caused, but it had gone much further. She looked at Michael, her eyes wide, seeking any kind of reassurance, but he only looked away, his expression hard. "We have to go," Michael finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. He sounded distant, a stranger in the aftermath of what they had done. "If anyone finds out, Rachel, they'll think this was planned. They'll think you went there with murder on your mind." Rachel nodded, still in shock. Together they moved quickly, wiping down surfaces, leaving no trace of their presence. With one last look at Clara's body, they hurried out, making their way down the darkened stairwell and out into the cold London night. They didn't speak a word to each other on the drive home, the silence filling the car with a dreadful weight. Rachel clenched her hands tightly, as if she could hold herself together, as if the sensation would keep her from falling apart. The days that followed were a nightmare for Rachel. She barely slept, every sound making her jump, every phone call setting her heart racing. She found herself replaying the moments in Clara's apartment over and over again. When she closed her eyes, she saw Clara's accusing gaze, heard her voice filled with disdain, her final retort before things had spiraled out of control. In those memories, Clara's face haunted her, twisted into a mocking sneer. Michael, on the other hand, threw himself into his work, retreating from her and avoiding any conversation about what had happened. She couldn't blame him. They were both implicated in this dark secret, but his reaction left her feeling utterly alone. The warmth that had once filled their marriage was replaced by a cold, stony distance. They barely spoke, each caught in their own torment, unable to bridge the chasm the murder had created between them. As days turned into weeks, Rachel's mental state worsened. She became paranoid, convinced that every look from neighbors, every casual conversation with friends, was laced with suspicion. She started seeing Clara's face in reflections, hearing her voice in the quiet of the night, as if Clara were haunting her from beyond the grave. The next morning, she drove to the police station, her heart pounding as she confessed the truth, reliving every agonizing detail of that night in Clara's apartment. The news of Clara's murder spread quickly, shaking their community. Rachel was arrested, and though she would face consequences, a part of her felt a strange relief. A weight lifted from her shoulders. She had traded her freedom for the release of her guilt, her actions a final attempt to find peace in the ruins of her life. Michael, left alone in their empty house, was consumed by the fallout of his choices. The affair, the betrayal, the lies. Each memory replayed in his mind, a reminder of how he had torn his family apart. He looked around at the hollow shell of his once happy home, haunted by Clara's memory and the destruction he had set in motion. In the end, it was the silence that consumed him, a silence that echoed in every room, a reminder of the choices he had made and the life he had destroyed.